Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we are diving headfirst into the epic 250-year tale of the House of Valois. This is a fascinating, honestly kind of chaotic family that practically dragged France kicking and screaming from a fractured, warring feudal state into a powerful modern nation. We're talking about a story of sheer survival, iron willpower, and unbelievable historical drama. Now, to really understand how they rose to power, we've got to start with something that is just, well, truly eerie. The year is 1314. Jacques de Molay, the very last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, is burning at the stake. And he doesn't beg for mercy. Instead, he screams out a curse, literally summoning the French king, Philip IV, to face the tribunal of God. And get this, incredibly, within the year, the king was actually dead. This single event seemingly sparked the sudden, rapid biological downfall of the mighty, and supposedly immortal, Capetian dynasty. So that leaves us with this massive historical puzzle, right? How does a completely new dynasty, one born basically from a legal trick, manage to survive 250 years of absolute catastrophe to invent the modern French nation-state? Keep that in the back of your mind, because their adapt-or-die survival story is nothing short of thrilling. Section 1. The Accidental Dynasty. A legal loophole to the throne. You look at this timeline, and the sheer speed of this dynastic collapse is just staggering. The Capetian line had ruled from father to son for over 300 years without a hitch. Then suddenly, it just evaporates. Philip IV dies of a stroke. Louis X dies after drinking chilled wine. An infant king dies at just 5 days old. And finally, Charles IV dies without a male heir. 4 kings, dead in just 14 years. It left the French throne completely and terrifyingly empty. As you can imagine, an empty throne creates a massive international crisis. Why? Because the closest male relative by blood was actually the King of England, Edward III. Totally horrified by the prospect of a foreign king, French lawyers frantically dusted off this ancient code called Salic Law. They famously declared the lily does not spin, which was basically their way of arguing that a woman could neither inherit the throne nor pass a claim down to her son. This massive legal maneuver successfully blocked Edward III and handed the crown to a French cousin, Philip of Valois. But, predictably, that loophole absolutely guaranteed the outbreak of the 100 Years' War. Moving on to Section 2, Catastrophe and the Plague. The failures of the chivalric ideal. So these early Valois kings, they totally saw themselves as these romantic medieval warriors. But their arrogance led to horrific defeats. Take the Battle of Sluys in 1340. The French naval fleet was so completely, totally annihilated by the English that absolutely no one in the court wanted to tell King Philip VI. Finally, only the court jester dared to break the news, joking that the English sailors were cowards because they didn't have the guts to jump into the water like the brave French. It's some seriously dark humor, but it was really just masking sheer military incompetence. And this lethal culture clash, that's exactly why the early Valois kept losing. Think about it. On one side, you have the French approach, entirely obsessed with heavy calorie charges, royal arrogance, and rigid codes of medieval honor. On the other side, you have the brutal English reality, strategic use of terrain, highly disciplined infantry, and the absolutely devastating efficiency of the longbow. At muddy battles like Crécy and Poitiers, the absolute flower of French nobility was simply slaughtered, mostly because they just refused to adapt to the new realities of war. 3 million gold crowns. I mean, try to wrap your head around that number. That was the astronomical ransom demanded by England when they humiliatingly captured the French king, John II, at the Battle of Poitiers. It was a total disaster. The king is sitting as a prisoner in London, the Black Death is ravaging the population back home, and heavily taxed peasants are in violent revolt. At this point, the Valois dynasty had effectively turned France into a bankrupt, hollowed-out shell. Which brings us to Section 3, The Miracle of Joan. Madness, Agincourt, and a peasant girl. You'd think it couldn't get worse, right? But before any miracle happens, the situation somehow took another nosedive. King Charles VI descends into prolonged bouts of madness, which triggers a vicious, bloody civil war among the French nobles. This absolute chaos invites yet another English invasion, leading to the cataclysmic slaughter at Agincourt. And it all culminates in what is easily the absolute darkest hour for the dynasty, the 1420 Treaty of Troyes. This treaty legally disinherited the French heir and handed the crown straight to an English infant. For all intents and purposes, France as an independent kingdom was abolished. By all logic, the Valois were finished. Done. But then along comes a teenage peasant girl named Joan of Arc, and she represented the absolute weaponization of divine legitimacy. You see, Joan wasn't just a religious figure. She was the ultimate political weapon for a totally desperate dynasty. She inspired the army to lift the siege of Orleans, and she completely restored the dynasty's legitimacy by having the disinherited Charles VII officially crowned at Reims. It was a complete, irrational reversal of fortune. Now, once the Valois got their crown back, Charles VII realized something crucial. They could never, ever rely on the old feudal ways again. So he initiated some vital reforms. He created a permanent, standing professional army. He instituted a permanent direct tax to actually fund it. He finally ended their reliance on those chaotic, independent feudal levies, and he instituted modern bronze cannons to just shatter English fortresses. This matters so much because Charles VII wasn't just winning a war here. He was literally replacing medieval chaos with a modern, tax-funded state machine that finally brought the 100 Years' War to an end.
That takes us to Section 4, the Spider King's Web, abandoning the sword for the pen.
If you want to see this dynasty's evolutionary shift, it is perfectly captured by looking at two major rivals. On one side, you have Louis XI, known as the Spider King. This was a guy who wore threadbare clothes, obsessed over ledgers and bureaucracy, and vastly preferred spies to soldiers. On the exact opposite side is his great rival, Charles the Bold of Burgundy, who was incredibly wealthy, highly militaristic, and still dreamed of forging this romantic chivalric empire. It is literally the ultimate showdown between the modern bureaucrat and the medieval knight. And spoiler alert, it was the Spider King who came out on top. But Louis XI didn't win by pitching glorious cavalry charges. Oh no. He quietly defeated his enemies through infinite patience, immense bribery, deep espionage, and just cold, ruthless pragmatism. It was a total masterclass in modern statecraft. He managed to trap his rivals in a Europe-wide web of diplomacy, centralized absolute power without pitching any major battles, and left behind a kingdom that was actually secure and unified. And finally, Section 5, Renaissance, Religion, and Ruin, the sudden collapse of a dynasty. So the direct Valois line ends in, honestly, one of the most shockingly absurd ways in royal history. King Charles VIII, a man who literally survived the brutal battlefields of the Italian wars, dies at just 28 years old because he violently strikes his head on a low stone doorframe. Boom. Just like that, the direct line is instantly extinguished. It beautifully and kind of tragically illustrates just how incredibly fragile royal succession really is. It forced the crown to pass laterally to cousin branches of the Valois family. What follows in the later Valois era is just a total roller coaster of incredible highs and devastating lows. In 1494, Charles VIII launches the Italian Wars. Fast forward to 1515, Francis I is brilliantly patronizing the Renaissance and centralizing all this power. But then disaster strikes yet again. In 1559, King Henry II is killed in a freak jousting accident when a splinter pierces his eye. It creates this sudden, massive power vacuum that the dynasty, frankly, just couldn't recover from. From there, the dominoes fall, and they fall with terrifying speed. First up, Henry's son Francis II dies young, leaving a very weak crown. Second, France completely tears itself apart in a three-way religious civil war between Catholics and Protestants, which is marked by Charles IX overseeing the horrific St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572. And finally, King Henry III is assassinated by a monk in 1589. With no direct heirs left at all, the Valois dynasty is ended forever, completely paving the way for the new Bourbon dynasty. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I've got to leave you with one final provocative thought. Was the bloody, paranoid legacy of the Valois the necessary price for dragging France out of the Middle Ages? Did this immense trauma, inflicted by and upon this very family, literally have to happen in order to build a centralized modern France? It's a fascinating historical dilemma to chew on. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this incredible era, and I'll catch you in our next explainer.